I am Fuji Koji, Technical Official of the 2nd Cultural Properties Division, Agency for Cultural Affairs. I'm going to talk about the system for the protection of cultural properties in Japan, especially buried cultural properties. Today's content is divided into 4 parts. First of all, the outline of the Cultural Properties Administration in Japan, and then the law for the protection of cultural properties. The first 2 parts will explain the whole picture of the protection of cultural properties. Next, I would like to explain the protection system for buried cultural properties. In the final part, I will talk about the handling of excavated artifacts, including the policy on the protection of buried cultural properties, which is part of my responsibilities. Let me explain the first part, the Cultural Properties Administration of Japan. Cultural properties are the precious property of our nation that was born, nurtured, and preserved and passed down to this day throughout the long history of our country. Buildings such as shrines and temples, Buddha statues, paintings, calligraphy, and other techniques such as performing arts and crafts, traditional events and festivals, and the natural landscapes that remain and are an integral part of the long history of historic villages and towns are also included in cultural properties. The law for the protection of cultural properties classifies these cultural properties into 6 categories. 1. Tangible cultural properties. 2. Intangible cultural properties. 3. Folk cultural properties. 4. Monuments. 5. Cultural landscapes. And 6. Groups of traditional buildings. Among these important items, the government designates, selects, and registers important cultural properties to protect them. In addition, we designate and register extremely valuable properties as important cultural properties and important intangible cultural properties. Especially valuable important cultural properties are designated as national treasures, while especially valuable historic sites, places of scenic beauty, and natural monuments are designated as a special category. Tangible cultural properties are structures, paintings, sculptures, crafts, calligraphic works, classical books, paleography, all of which are considered to be items that have especially high value. Other historical or academically valuable materials are also called tangible cultural properties. Of these, it is collectively referred to as fine arts and crafts, other than buildings. This is a terracotta figure called a dogu, which is classified as a tangible cultural property and designated as an important cultural property. Dogu is a humanoid figure made of clay. Many images are in the shape of women, a characteristic of dogu. This dogu is an example from the late Jomon period, around 1000 BC to 400 BC, where the various clay figurines were developed and stylized. This dogu is called shikoki dogu, or literally light-blocking device dogu, because its eyes resemble goggles, a light-blocking device worn by the Inuit. The Inuit are indigenous people in the northern region and used these goggles to reduce the light while out in the snow. Since this dogu was unearthed by excavation, it is categorized as a buried cultural property under the law for the protection of cultural properties. Intangible cultural properties refers to stage performances, music, craft techniques, and other intangible cultural properties that possess high historic or artistic value. It is embodied by individuals or groups of individuals who represent the highest mastery of the techniques concerned. This is kabuki, which is designated as an important intangible cultural property. Kabuki is one of the Japanese stage performances developed from the 17th to the 19th century. Kabuki is one of the three major dramas of Japan, along with No and Ningyo Joruri, or puppet drama. It is a comprehensive performing art that incorporates elements of various performing arts, such as the preceding or parallel No and Kyogen, and has been stylized. Thereby, it became popular among common people. Kabuki is said to have started in the early 17th century, and it gradually refined with the times since the latter half of the 17th century. In the course of development, kabuki became a classic and highly sophisticated form in the middle of the 19th century. It still entertains a lot of people today. Preservation efforts are centered around clarifying the contents of kabuki as an important intangible cultural property, and elements such as actors, programs, performances, and production are stipulated clearly. Kabuki was listed in the representative list of the Intangible Cultural Heritage of UNESCO in 2008, since it is a traditional style and method of performance. Folk cultural properties are items such as manners and customs, folk performing arts and folk techniques, and includes clothing, tools, dwellings related to food, clothing, housing, occupation, religious belief or annual events. These are indispensable in understanding the transition of lifestyle. This is a set of fishing equipment for herring or nishin fish in Hokkaido, the north of the Japanese archipelago. This equipment is designated as an important tangible folk cultural property. In Hokkaido, herring fishing was carried out by the Ainu indigenous people since a long time ago, and it became an industry in the 17th century. However, in the 20th century, due to a chronic shortage of fish catch, herring fishing ended in 1955. This is a valuable set of fishing gear that has remained as it was then. The collection consists of around 3,700 tools. We recognize the values of the equipment to show local characteristics of tools for agriculture, fishing, handicrafts, textile and workshops, and try to preserve them under designation. The monuments are divided into three categories. First, historic sites, such as shell mounds, ancient tombs, sites of castle towns, sites of forts or castles, and old houses, and those with high historic or scientific value to Japan. Second, places of scenic beauty, such as gardens, bridges, gorges, seashores and mountains, as well as those with high artistic or aesthetic value for Japan. Third, natural monuments in animals, plants, and geological features with high scientific value to Japan. You may think that these three things are not relevant at first glance, but they are protected in an integrated manner as a monument. Monuments literally mean the memorial in Japanese, meaning keep it as a memory. So, the historic site, places of scenic beauty, and natural monument are summarized in the meaning of the land and the region that you want to keep. This is a monument. It is a reconstruction of the Nara Palace site, a special historic site among the monuments. It was originally built about 1,300 years ago in Nara City, Nara Prefecture. Nara was a capital of Japan for 74 years during what was called the Nara period. The palace was built in 710, which was modelled on the capital of Chang'an, the capital city of China during the Tang dynasty. Nara was the center for Empress Genmei's political administration. It is said that more than 100,000 people lived in this large city, which was arranged in a grid pattern. This building is the former Imperial Audience Hall, located to the north of the Nara Palace site, and was a central facility in the ancient imperial capital. It was also the central building and place where important national rituals, such as the emperor's enthronement and audience with foreign envoys, were conducted. The building has been reconstructed in recent years, based on facts revealed by historical materials and archaeological excavations. These belong to the category of monuments and are protected as buried cultural properties under the law. Cultural landscapes are formed by the climate of a given region and people's lives or work there, and are indispensable for understanding the livelihood and work of the Japanese people. This photo is of terraced rice fields located in Obasute, Nagano Prefecture, which is selected as an important cultural landscape. It consists of about 1,500 paddy fields. At the beginning of the 17th century, the area had been used for both farming and rice cultivation. Later, rice cultivation gradually became dominant on the slope. In the middle of the 19th century, the rice terraces were formed throughout the slope at between 460 to 550 meters above sea level. It became one of the leading cultural landscapes. This unique cultural landscape tells us how farmers have used the land to carry out agriculture continuously from the late 16th century to the present day, and is indispensable for understanding the lives or livelihoods of Japanese people. Groups of traditional buildings are commonly valued, particularly when these traditional buildings are integrated with the surrounding environment. This photo shows the preservation area of the Sumago-juku traditional buildings in Nagano Prefecture. It is one of the post towns on the Nakasendo Highway in the Kiso area, located in the central part of Japan. The Nakasendo Highway was one of the roads connecting the political center of Edo, Tokyo, with local regional areas. The construction of these highways was started around the middle of the 17th century. From the 17th to the 19th centuries, post towns were villages that had developed in this period and were located at key points of the highway. Post towns were equipped with inns and tea houses where travellers could stay or rest. After the middle of the 19th century, new railways and roads were developed. As a result, the towns lost their function as an inn and declined. Come the 20th century, the townscape, which tells us the history of early modern post towns before the 19th century, was re-evaluated, and a wide range of districts around the post town, including the scenery of inns and buildings alongside the road, the scenery of the highway, the farmer-style building and the field, and the scenery seen from the highway, were decided to be preserved. The area retains vestiges of the mid-19th century very well, and the traditional buildings and their surrounding environment show outstanding regional characteristics. Aside from these 6 categories of cultural properties, the cultural properties buried in the land are called buried cultural properties, and the traditional techniques and skills necessary for the preservation and repair of cultural properties are called conservation techniques for cultural properties, and these 2 categories are the object of protection under the law. Of these, the division I belong to is responsible for the preservation of buildings, monuments, and buried cultural properties of tangible cultural properties, and my area of expertise is buried cultural properties. I have introduced some representative examples of cultural property types. The buried cultural property that I am in charge of is not included in the 6 types of cultural properties, but is defined as a cultural property buried in the ground. These historic sites were originally a kind of buried cultural property. As shown in this photo, the Irinosawa site of Miyagi Prefecture, which is a site from the Kofun period, dating to around 300 AD, and the Ozuka tomb in Fukuoka Prefecture, a typical type of tomb in Japan in the Kofun period, around 550 AD, and the Fujiwara Palace site in Nara Prefecture, just before the relocation of the capital to Nara Palace. As a result of excavations, the value of these sites has become clear, and all of them are designated as special and historic sites among tangible cultural properties to be protected. In addition, excavated artifacts are also tangible cultural properties, and a kind of buried cultural property because they were buried in the ground. Therefore, if the importance of the excavated artifacts is found, it may be designated as a national treasure or an important cultural property among tangible cultural properties. In this way, buried cultural properties can also be classified as cultural properties because they are a type of cultural property in a broader sense. Then, let me briefly explain the procedure from the designation of cultural properties to the preservation under the law. First of all, a local government where relevant cultural properties are located conducts a survey on the basic matters and values of cultural properties. If the survey finds the cultural properties valuable scientifically and culturally to Japan, the local government submits a recommendation to the Minister of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology, or MEXT. Then, MEXT will consult with the Council for Cultural Affairs, which is an advisory body to the Agency for Cultural Affairs, to determine whether it is appropriate for designation. The Council for Cultural Affairs also requests a survey from an investigative committee of specialists, organised by academic experts who are familiar with categories of cultural property, and receives the report. If the contents of the report deem it fit for designation, the Council for Cultural Affairs reports to MEXT. Then, MEXT designates it. The designation of this cultural property will be announced in the official gazette and communicated to its owner to exert legal effect. Here is a list of the cultural properties of Japan, designated through such a procedure. Among the national treasures and important cultural properties of tangible cultural properties, 10,772 fine arts and crafts were designated, 2,497 structures, which is a total of 13,269 designations. Of these, 1,119 have been designated as national treasures, which are especially important items. Important intangible cultural properties have been designated by 110 persons and 30 groups as arts and crafts techniques. In addition, there are 312 important intangible folk cultural properties, such as manners and customs, folk performing arts and techniques, and 221 important tangible folk cultural properties, such as tools, used in intangible folk cultural properties. There were 1,823 historic sites, 415 places of scenic beauty, 1,030 natural monuments, which is a total of 3,268. Of these, special historic sites, special places of scenic beauty, and special natural monuments are 173. The number of these designations is increasing as the survey progresses. In addition, 468,000 places are understood in the land where buried cultural properties are stored. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk in more detail about the framework for protecting these designated cultural properties. Next, I will explain the law for the protection of cultural properties, which defines the system of cultural properties and the mechanism of protection as described in the lecture in the first half. Especially, I will focus on buried cultural properties. The law for the protection of cultural properties was enacted in 1950 as Japan's first general law for the protection of cultural properties after a fire broke out in 1949, a year before the enactment. The fire destroyed mural paintings in a main hall of Horyuji Temple, which is said to have been established in the 7th century. The law for the protection of cultural properties consists of 13 chapters. Chapter 1 is General Provisions. Chapter 2 has been removed, but there were provisions on the Committee for the Protection of Cultural Properties, the predecessor organisation of the Agency for Cultural Affairs. From Chapter 3 to Chapter 10, there are chapters on the provisions of 6 categories of cultural properties. These are stipulated for the definition of the classification of each cultural property and the procedures related to protection. After that, Chapter 11 stipulates the provisions concerning consultation to the Council for Cultural Affairs for protection by the national government. Chapter 13, the last chapter, provides for penalties in case of failing to comply with the rules. Chapter 1 defines the purpose of this law. This slide shows the purpose of this Act. In addition, Article 4 calls on all citizens to cooperate in measures to achieve the purpose of this law. Let's take a closer look at buried cultural properties. The provisions for buried cultural properties are stipulated in Chapter 6. It is divided into 4 major categories. Articles 92 to 95 are provisions concerning excavation. Articles 96 and 97 are provisions concerning the discovery of archaeological sites. Articles 98 to 99 are provisions in regards to the enforcement of excavations by the Commissioner of the Agency for Cultural Affairs, hereinafter called the Commissioner of the ACA, and local governments. Articles 100 to 108 stipulate the handling of excavated items. Let me explain the mechanism of protection of buried cultural properties discovered when a development such as road construction and building construction work occurs. The exact location and depth of the buried cultural property and the contents of the buried cultural property are not known until it is revealed by excavations. The protection of buried cultural properties can be organised into 4 stages. First of all, it is the stage of comprehension and dissemination. At this stage, distribution surveys, trial excavations, and confirmation surveys are conducted in order to investigate the scope of buried cultural properties underground. Then, a development project plan is formulated. Here is the second stage of the protection of buried cultural properties: coordination and arrangement. In cases where we know that part of the development contains archaeological sites, they are called areas known to have buried cultural properties, hereinafter called AHCP. The development project plan must be submitted or notified in accordance with provisions of Articles 93 and 94 of the law. Upon receiving notification of the plan, a trial excavation will be conducted to determine the extent and characteristics of buried cultural properties. As a result, if it is confirmed that there are archaeological sites, discussion of handling it are made in order to preserve the current situation without damaging the sites. Even if archaeological sites happen to be discovered outside of the AHCP once a construction has begun, it is mandatory to notify authorities under the provisions of Articles 96 and 97 of the law. After mutual consultation, the site is either preserved as it is, or we carry out excavation and investigation for recording when it is impossible to preserve the site's present state. From the review of the development project plan, if the sites are preserved on site, some part of them will be designated as historic sites, or local governments will take measures to preserve and improve the site in order to make people understand. As for the sites that have been preserved as it is, excavations will be conducted in some cases in order to understand the area of the archaeological site and obtain necessary information for utilization and restoration. As a result of the handling consultation, if we find it difficult to preserve it as it is, we will conduct an urgent excavation to record the site. If an important site is discovered as a result of this excavation, we may once again hold consultations on the handling of buried cultural properties. After these procedures, the construction of the development project plan will begin. Now, I will explain each article related to the protection of buried cultural properties in the law. Article 92 is a provision concerning the notification in regards to excavation for investigation of buried cultural properties. In order to prevent the destruction of these buried cultural properties by unplanned excavations, notification is mandatory before an excavation begins. Those who intend to conduct excavations must report at least 30 days in advance. This notification must be reported not only in AHCP areas, but also in other lands. The Commissioner of the ACA may order the prohibition or suspension of excavations when it is particularly necessary for the protection of buried cultural properties. There are provisions for penalties. Failure to notify will result in a fine of not more than 50,000 yen, and failure to obey prohibition orders will lead to a penalty of not more than 100,000 yen. Article 93 is a provision concerning notification related to civil engineering works. When excavating land in an AHCP, it is mandatory to report it at least 60 days in advance. By the act of excavation, we mean not only the excavation itself, but acts that substantially alter the sites, for example, embankments or structures, or acts that may make future surveys impossible. The Commissioner of the ACA may instruct the conducting of archaeological excavations to record if the excavation is particularly necessary for protection. Article 94 is a special provision for excavation by the national government or government-related organisations. national government agencies that intend to excavate the AHCP shall notify the Commissioner of the ACA of the formulation and implementation of the project plan. The Commissioner of the ACA can request necessary consultation on the notification. This special provision was enacted based on the conventional practices of concluding memorandums, etc., with various organisations such as public corporations. In this way, excavations for recording may be carried out under Articles 93 and 94 if we find it difficult to maintain the current state of the site by development works. The left picture shows an emergency archaeological excavation performed before the road construction began. You can see that the excavation is carried out along the shape of the road which will be constructed. Two pictures on the right also show archaeological excavations. Excavations are very time-consuming and costly because after a certain amount of digging by machinery, further excavation must be done by hand to avoid damaging archaeological evidence. In the photo on the upper right, you can see that at the same time as conducting excavations in front of you, construction work has already started in the background. As I mentioned earlier, the purpose of emergency excavations is to create a report of buried cultural properties that could not be preserved. The picture in the upper right is taken during the archaeological survey of the site to create the reference points for plans and drawings. It takes a lot of effort and time because the drawing is measured by hand. Therefore, in recent years, a three-dimensional laser measuring instrument, the one shown in the lower right photo, has also been introduced to shorten the field survey period. This laser instrument allows us to create not only conventional drawings, seen on the lower left, but also data that contains elevation information in drawings in the middle left. Photo data can also be attached. I will return to the article of the law. Article 96 is a provision concerning notification of the discovery and is a system to ensure the period of time when an investigation for protection is required. If you discover an archaeological site, an owner of the land must report it first without changing the current status. If necessary, the Commissioner of the ACA may order the suspension or prohibition of acts. In addition, the instruction can be made even without notification to protect the site. Failure to notify will result in a fine of not more than 50,000 yen, and failure to obey prohibition orders would lead to a penalty of not more than 500,000 yen. Article 97 is a special provision in cases where sites are discovered by the agencies of the national government or government-related organisations. If a national organisation discovers the sites, it must notify the Commissioner of the ACA without delay and without changing the current status of the site. The Commissioner of the ACA may notify the institution to consult about investigation and preservation if the sites are important. The institutions that receive this notice must discuss it. Article 99 is a provision concerning the enforcement of excavations by local governments. Local governments are allowed to conduct excavations of lands that are recognised for existing buried cultural properties if necessary, and in this case, no notification under Article 92 is required. That clarifies the authority of local governments in excavation. However, this excavation is not carried out by force and is based on the consent of owners and possessors of the land. The excavation is often carried out during the notification period of a development work. The local government asks business operators to give permission to enter the land for investigation, to change or postpone a plan of the development, and to cover necessary expenses. Next, I'm going to explain the handling of excavated artifacts. This slide shows the procedures related to the handling of excavated artifacts. The buried objects found are not first subject to the law for the protection of cultural properties, but are subject to the Civil Code and the Lost Property Act. In accordance with Article 4, Paragraph 1 of the Lost Goods Act, the discoverer is required to give the buried objects to the police. If the owner of the objects is known, the police will return them to the owner. On the other hand, if the owner is not known, and the objects are found to be cultural properties, they will be submitted to the Prefectural Board of Education or designated City Board of Education in that particular area. The Board of Education will examine whether it is a cultural property or not. If the objects are not cultural properties, the objects will be returned to the police, while if they are cultural properties, the Board of Education will notify the police that the objects are recognised as cultural property. Who has the ownership of them? If the objects are found by national organisations, the ownership goes to the National Treasury. Otherwise, the ownership goes to the prefectural government. The discoverers and landowners will receive a compensation for the amount equivalent to the price of the cultural property. Let me explain articles of the law for the protection of cultural properties related to ownership. Articles 101 and 102 provide provisions on responses if buried objects are found to be a cultural property, but the owner is not known. The chief of the police station must immediately submit the said object to the Board of Education of the prefecture, a designated city, or a core city. The receiving Board of Education must examine and ascertain if the object is a cultural property, and if the object is assessed to be a cultural property, the Board of Education must notify the fact to the chief of the police station. If the object is not a cultural property, it should be returned to the chief of the police station. Article 103 provides for what to do if there is a request for return from the owner of a buried object that has been certified as a cultural property. According to the provisions of Article 100 and 102, when the chief of the police station has received a request from the owner of the object to return it, even when it is acknowledged as a cultural property, the Commissioner of the ACA or the Board of Education of a prefecture, a designated city, or a core city must return the said object to the chief of the police station. Articles 104 to 107 stipulate the ownership, incentive remuneration, and transfer of excavated cultural properties. According to the provisions of the Civil Code regarding a buried property, its finder will gain ownership if the owner is not identified within 6 months from its public notice. When the property was found in land owned by another person, the ownership will be shared with the owner of the land. However, regarding a cultural property which is a national treasure, its ownership will provisionally belong to the nation or the prefecture. Having done that, if there is no need for the nation or the prefecture to continue in possession of the property, it may be transferred to the finder or the owner of the land. Based on such legal systems, buried cultural properties have been protected by the governments. This slide shows the transition of the administration of buried cultural properties. The graph on the left shows the transition of staff specialising in buried cultural properties in local governments and related organisations. In 1971, when statistics began, only 194 people were specialised in buried cultural properties, but in 1999 the number reached 7,111. As the economy grew, development projects increased. In order to deal with the increased projects, more and more staff was allocated in local government organisations. Later, with the decrease in development projects, the number of specialists has decreased as well. There were 5,592 last year. The same trend can be confirmed in the graph on the right, which is a transition chart of expenses spent on excavation. The largest cost of excavations in Japan reached 132.1 billion yen in 1997, but has halved to 56.6 billion in 2018. However, the Agency for Cultural Affairs does not believe that the administration for the protection of buried cultural properties exists to perform excavation work alone. As we have seen earlier, in Japan, administrative officers have been assigned to undertake an increasing number of investigative excavations for documentation and preservation. In the future, the Agency for Cultural Affairs would like to create a virtuous cycle involving these 4 stages: comprehension dissemination, coordination arrangement, preservation, and utilization of the outcome from excavation work to enhance the understanding of buried cultural properties and gain broad understanding for the people. For this purpose, we have provided various supports, including subsidy schemes to local governments, to achieve these objectives.